So of course it's one thing understanding the process of emotional regulation, but this doesn't always mean that it's easy to put into practice. And emotional regulation is complicated enough as it is, but if there are neurodevelopmental difficulties, such as the ones listed here, this process can become even harder, particularly with children with their underdeveloped brains. And these are just some of the resulting difficulties that we often see when it comes to neurodevelopmental difficulties. So things like interaction, self-control, learning, attention and concentration. And I'm just going to go through these in a little bit more detail. So take information processing, for example, and this is really the way that we understand, process and act on any information that comes into us. And it includes things like processing speed as well, so how quickly we're able to convert what's said to us into something that makes sense or we can do something with. So for example, being given an instruction to follow and being able to process what is that instruction and then what do I need to do about that instruction. Without appropriate interventions, such as visual step-by-step instructions, this process can become really frustrating for children with neurodevelopmental difficulties and really quite distressing, impacting on emotional regulation. We can also think about interaction as well. So with neurodevelopmental difficulties, we know that there is often a struggle to understand others as well as to be understood, making social interaction difficult, causing frustration and potential distress, again impacting on our emotional understanding, our emotional ability to regulate and do something about those emotions. Self-control is a huge one when it comes to neurodevelopmental difficulties. So this is what we spoke about in part 2, the process of good communication between our downstairs brain and our upstairs brain, our emotional brain and our thinking brain. And recent neuroscience research has indicated that in autism particularly, the prefrontal cortex, so the bit that helps to regulate the emotional brain, has reduced activity. So perhaps our lids get flipped much more quickly. It's also the bit of the brain that develops last, up to the age of 25, perhaps even beyond. So even without a neurodevelopmental diagnosis, this controlling of emotions, our inhibiting of responses, pausing before reacting, that's a really difficult process. Add on the complications of being a child and having a neurodevelopmental difficulty, and this becomes a whole new world of difficulty for that child. Finally, I'm just going to touch on sensory processing because this has a huge impact on the way that we're able to manage frustration and distress. So sensory processing is really the way that we interpret incoming information. And senses bombard us every single moment that we're awake. Making sense of all of these sensations can be really tricky, particularly when in neurodevelopmental difficulties there are often problems with hyperarousal or hypoarousal, so being almost too aware of sensations or not aware enough of sensations. And this can mean that the intensity of reactions and the way that we're triggered by different sensations can cause a lot of frustration and distress for children, leading to disruptive and dysregulated behaviour. So a further difficulty with emotional regulation is the fact that emotional reactions are really quick and actually much quicker than our thoughts. So our brain is wired to look for either threats or to look for rewards. And if one is detected, the feeling part of the brain, so the emotional part of the brain, quickly responds with the release of chemical messages. And these are ultimately our emotions. So detection of threats releases adrenaline or cortisol, which prepares us for our fight, flight, freeze response. Detection of rewards releases dopamine, oxytocin or serotonin, which are our feel-good hormones, and they motivate us to want to do things and to do better. But release of any of these chemicals is really quick and automatic. And this is really important to keep us safe and protected. Ultimately, if we were in front of a bear, we wouldn't want to be waiting for our thoughts to kick in to know what to do. We want our body to respond immediately and automatically to know to run away from that threat. Our emotions respond quickly to keep us safe. And whilst this is great in certain situations, it can definitely cause problems in others. And because the feeling bit kicks in before the thinking bit, particularly if the feeling is very strong or overwhelming, it can prevent us from thinking rationally in the moment, even when there isn't a real threat. So for example, if we're told to come off our Xbox, if that feels like a threat, even though that we know ultimately that we're safe, if the threat hormones are released and we respond in a fight, flight or freeze response and our lid is flipped, this happens before we even know what we should do or what we want to do. Our emotions basically hijack our brain in that moment and stop us from thinking and responding rationally. And if you want to think a little bit further about this, the Sentis animation brain series called Emotions in the Brain, that provides a really good summary of why emotional reactions can really interfere with our thought processes at times. So to make it even more complicated, as well as the immediate detection of threat or reward when dangers are presented to us in the here and now, we also learn through life that sometimes something might produce a threatening or a rewarding response. So our emotions get paired with emotional memories, and we learn that something is either good or bad. And every time that experience reoccurs, either threat or reward chemical messages get released based on that learned interpretation of the event. So every experience we have is linked with an emotional response linked to that experience, and that impacts on our response to the event, which can perpetuate the situation. So just to make a little bit more sense of this, imagine a child that was attacked by a dog. So their emotional brain is linking that memory, that experience of dogs with the emotion of fear. So their interpretation of dogs is that they're a really scary thing. And every time they then see a dog, that fight, flight, freeze response is activated. And the response to that is often that we might avoid dogs in the future, which means that we never get a chance to disprove that belief. So we end up stuck in this cycle of believing the dog is frightening without ever getting a chance to prove it wrong. The important thing to remember here is that the body responds in the same way to objective threats, such as snakes and bears or loud noises, as it does to things that might not actually be life-threatening. If you've learned it's a threat, the same process happens regardless, and the same parts of the brain start firing. So that might be let's go to school, get in the shower, get off your Xbox. This creates then a sense of being out of control when that threat is detected, and it can be hard to pull back because the emotions start to fire so quickly. Another problem can arise when people have different interpretations of the same problem, and that can lead to conflict. So as stated in the previous slide, past experiences are linked to emotional memories and interpretations, and this might be different for every single person. So take the example of having a shower. For one person, having a shower might be a really ordinary, normal experience and quite a pleasurable thing. But for a child with sensory difficulties, for example, they might have learnt that that shower is uncomfortable or painful even. And every time that request is made for them to have a shower, they experience a flood of threat messages. They have adrenaline, cortisol flooding their body, leading to an extreme emotional response. If the parent in this situation doesn't remember that experience affects interpretation and response, they then might be prevented from perspective taking and simply see the child's reaction as, "You're making a problem for me," leading to this huge conflict and build-up of emotion for both the parent and the child. So it's really important to remember that your child's behaviour is always just a communication of their emotions. If you yourself can stop and think and use your well-developed brain to help out your child, almost lend them your brain, and respond in a rational way, taking into account their perspective, things are going to be a whole lot better. So be curious about their behaviour. Try to understand their interpretation and their point of view. Always remember that their interpretation is likely to be different from yours. And by reconsidering your interpretation, you're more likely to lessen the chances of conflict and escalation and find your way out of a repeating pattern of unhelpful behaviour.